at what a crazy year. As you suggest, the word tumultuous is certainly appropriate looking back here at 2020, but a lot of great things in spite of the challenges that our country has faced, that our world has faced. A lot of great things happened in 2020. And that's really what today's webinar is all about. I can't help but reflect on the history of Webinar Wednesday without reflecting on this date, March 16th of 2020. That's the day that our world, both personally and professionally, changed for what has seemed like forever. That was the day that we realized that our company, that was accustomed to visiting customers in person, to shaking hands, to attending trade shows, to being part of STEM events, we were no longer going to be able to do that. That we were in an era now where we had to be a virtual company. So we changed plenty. We changed the way that we met. We started meeting virtually every single day. We started meeting with suppliers as they updated us on changes in their technology. We used that time as best we could. We started reaching out to customers about opportunities to utilize virtual and e-learning platforms for education. We started using those platforms for our own team as they looked at earning third-party credentials in areas like Industry 4.0, again, taking advantage of this time as best we could where we could not be in front of our customers. All kinds of innovations came from that era for our company. And one of those innovations is what we're doing here today, Webinar Wednesday. So we're going to take a look back at some of the best examples of the webinars that we were able to produce this year and reminisce a little bit about everything we've learned here on Webinar Wednesday. We're going to talk about technical education information. We're going to talk about what we learned in the area of new technology. We'll share best practices in technical education and examples from our webinars where we talked about best practices. We are going to cover certifications, third-party certifications, industry credentials, industrial training, workforce training, and virtual learning. And we're going to cover all of this by, again, reflecting back on everything that we learned this year, 2020, on Webinar Wednesday. First, with regard to information, we tried to do our best to provide updates on information, on news, on things that were happening in technical education. One example of that, in fact, one of my favorite episodes, I'll admit, was when we shared the things that we thought the new president needed to know about technical education. We aired this the day after the election. We had a little bit of fun with that, and as of that day, we did not yet know who our next president was going to be. But in either event, whichever of the individuals was elected, we had things we wanted them to know about. We shared them with you, and indirectly we shared them with them on Webinar Wednesday. We also talked about the latest in HVAC training technology and advancements in HVAC training technology as a message to our customers. And Jason Everett of Amatrol joined us, talked a little bit about an experience that he had in a local restaurant not too long before that webinar. Let's hear what he had to say.
So I was at a barbecue restaurant, a chain down in Florida last week, and it was relatively hot and stuffy in there. And we asked the waitress if she could turn on the AC. She said, well, I have to call corporate to have them turn the AC on. So she actually went away for a few minutes, called corporate, and all of a sudden the HVAC system turned on. So just as an example of how corporations are managing costs using connected systems.
So one example from Jason's discussion about HVAC technology, about how companies are managing costs in the world of HVAC. And we learned a tremendous amount from Jason that day. We also learned quite a bit from Jordan Alsop. Jordan is with Denford, and he joined us live from England to talk about using an F1 Formula One challenge in schools, a STEM challenge, showing students how they could build faster and faster miniature race cars, and a program that has taken place and has taken hold all over England and is starting to take hold here in the United States as well. That was a really great example early on in the days of Webinar Wednesday. We also presented to you Industry 4.0. Many of our educators are teaching Industry 4.0 technology in the classroom today, using 4 classes on mechatronics, industrial controls, robotics, and IIoT. And we talked about what could come after those 4 courses for students that are going through that curriculum. Another week, we talked about Industry Infinity 0.0. This is the whole idea that technology is advancing in industry so quickly that we believe there will not be an Industry 5.0, that we are in an era of continuing revolution and evolution in industrial technology, and that evolution will continue. We will be in a consistent state of industrial revolution for many, many years to come. We also shared with you some information from Mid-State Technical College. This was an interesting webinar to put on because we had to produced the whole webinar within about an hour of gathering the footage. So we were on site at the commemoration event for a facility that Midstate Technical College is building in Stevens Point, Wisconsin. Their dean, Ryan Koski, joined us to talk about that innovation. And then we had to package all that together and go live about an hour later. Here's how that looked in the words of Ryan Koski.
Our primary focus was going to be machine tool welding. In expanding out, we will duplicate our machine tool program in Stevens Point. We have a 2-year technical diploma in machine tool as a machine tool technician. The first year of that program will be offered in both Wisconsin Rapids and Stevens Point. And then the second year, which is primarily our automated and CNC system and manufacturing, will be offered only in the Stevens Point campus. Same thing with welding. Welding's a 1-year technical diploma, and that'll be a duplicate program.
So 2020 was a year of new facilities. In the case of Midstate Technical College, planning for a brand new facility that they are building in Stevens Point, Wisconsin. Another example of a great facility was the apprenticeship program at Western Technical College, and their dean, Josh Gamer, joined us to talk about how he and his team are teaching robotics and electromechanical technology as part of their new apprenticeship and industry training center in La Crosse, Wisconsin. Knowing that employers are having such a challenge filling industrial electrician, industrial maintenance roles, tell us how your program helps to address that challenge.
I think part of it is, you have to create an environment in which is going to attract future students, an environment in which they actually want to work in. So when we can tell the story about the advanced equipment that these students will be working on within industry and the wages that are associated with them, I think that problem becomes much less. You can see right there as we're looking at, it's a fully automated manufacturing line. It's got the FANUC arm, it's got hydraulics, pneumatics, safety devices, sensors, and we can actually insert up to 40 different faults in the control panel that students have to troubleshoot. So again, investing in the technology that represents what is within industry today, I think will make a world of a difference for these potential future students.
And investing in that technology is exactly what Western Technical College did. And we're so very thankful to Josh and his team for joining us for Webinar Wednesday just a couple short weeks ago. On that topic of being thankful, I have to admit that one of my absolute favorite episodes of Webinar Wednesday this year was the one, it was Melissa's idea that we aired right before Thanksgiving, where we reached out to instructors and to teachers and to administrators. And we said, right before Thanksgiving, what in your program are you thankful for? Who are you thankful for in your program, or who is somebody who influenced your life for whom you were thankful? It ended up being a fairly emotional episode of Webinar Wednesday, where people got a little bit emotional themselves as they reflected back on the individuals who had had such a strong influence on the people that they became. One of those folks was Wayne Broke, or Wayne is an instructor at Waukesha County Technical College. And here's what he shared about a former boss of his.
Thank a man by the name of John Morgan. John Morgan was my first boss when I got into the manufacturing field. But John was much more than a boss. He was a mentor. He was a very, very patient man, to say the least. He fielded a lot of questions from me, but he was always very encouraging, and he encouraged me to learn more about the field. He was a wealth of information himself, but he also encouraged me to go out and continue my education.
So here on Webinar Wednesday, we gave folks like Wayne the opportunity to thank people that had had such an influence on his life, and then he can go on and influence his students in much the same way that his boss influenced him so many years ago. We all have mentors like that. We all have people who have put us on a new course, and the instructors and the teachers and the professors and everybody who works in technical education, that is exactly what you do, and we're so very thankful for that. We're also thankful for the opportunity to share with you information about new technology that is coming of age and emerging in the field of technical education. We are in an era of continuing evolution and revolution, not just in industry, but also in technical education. And we brought to you on Webinar Wednesday this year some really, really interesting innovations and tools that instructors, teachers, professors, tech ed programs are using all over the country to inspire young people toward careers in technical fields and in industry, and to inspire them in the classroom. One of those examples is the new EDU mill. Now, as you can see in this box, this is a CNC machine, but it actually does some things that most CNC machines can't do. And our friends from LaVille joined us to talk a little bit about this project. Let's hear what they had to say.
One of the features that this machine has is that you can switch from a CNC to a 3D printer. The 3D printer that fuse deposition modeling, that's what this machine does. You can do dual or single extraction. It uses a direct drive for the extruder system. It has a heated plate as well, to that the workable size will be 220 by 220. Materials that we've been using with this machine, you can do PLA, ABS, PETG, but we've been also working with a wide variety of other materials that you can use with the milling machine.
So a CNC machine that not only machines ferrous metal using, by the way, a FANUC control, but also 3D prints products using exactly the same piece of equipment. That is the kind of innovation that we are seeing in industrial technology and industrial and technical education. So that was a really, really fascinating presentation that LaVille did as part of Webinar Wednesday. We were also joined by Tony Neiswander and Tim Tassler of APT to talk about their new robotic weld cell for education. This is a robotic weld cell that uses a FANUC robot and a Miller power source. I can tell you from experience that we have tremendous numbers of educators that have been asking for that product for years. I was actually at APT just yesterday. It is really, really cool. We are expecting tremendous interest in that product in 2021 and are already seeing tremendous interest in that product. Also seeing lots and lots of interest in Exact Metals 3D printing, metal 3D printing technology. Now, one of the things we like to do on Webinar Wednesday is to ask our attendees, and more important, ask our guests some out-of-the-box questions. One of the questions that we asked the CEO of Exact Metal, a gentleman by the name of Juan Mario Gomez, was tell us about the culture of your company, not just the technology, and we talked about his technology, but here he was right in State College, Pennsylvania, drawing a really, really interesting, innovative, high-energy workforce, and we asked Juan Mario about that on Webinar Wednesday.
It's just great. I mean, the idea that we're in State College, Pennsylvania, it's fun. It's a small university town, but it's also next to Penn State, so there's lots of talent and capability near us. Just like the 3D printing business is, also our companies like that. You have people like Dave and myself that are scarred, has scars to experience in life, and have done many crazy things. But there's also young people like Stevie that you see in the picture here, who are just fearless. They have great ideas. They have great motivation. They really love the technology. They love what they're doing, and they just need some guidance and direction. And then they're changing the world. And that type of culture we want to keep here within Exact Metals. One that we're young and energetic, but we also are behind our customers. We're behind what we're doing. We deliver a good product that's ready to go from the beginning, that we support it well.
So the words that Juan Mario uses right there, changing the world. That is what technical education does. That is what our teachers, our instructors, our administrators, that is what you do. Change the world. And that's why we are so very proud to work with you here on Webinar Wednesday and to share some really, really interesting innovations. Speaking of changing the world of technology continues to change. We have a new electric car lab that is adapting to that change. This is a product from Mind's Eye Education. And we were joined not too long ago by Terry Graham, their vice president, and by Levi Wilson, who he's really their chief tinkerer. He's their chief technology person. He's also the general manager of the company, but just a brilliant person. Talked to us about the emerging technology in the electric car market.
There is a great deal of overlap between most electronic cars and autonomous vehicles. Most electronic cars have the ability to monitor their wheel speeds, things like that, their motion, their power much more closely than a gas engine does. They can regulate those a lot more efficiently, which allows more feedback for an autonomous vehicle. So it makes building an autonomous vehicle much easier to start off with if you use a base electric car as the chassis.
So some really, really interesting technology in the world of electric cars that is making its way into education. And we are so excited for what the future holds for products like that. We're also excited about the future of drone technology. And like so much of what we do on Webinar Wednesday, it's not just about the technology. It's not just about the product. More important, and I do mean more important, it's about how we deliver the learning. What do we want the student to know, and what do we want them to be able to do when the learning is done? Here's an example of sharing those types of best practices under the umbrella of drone technology.
So let's talk about our 7 planes of drone learning. Number 1, energy types and transfer. We can also teach physical constructions of frames and chassis, controllers and microcontrollers and control science, drone code and coding, principles and dynamics of motion and flight, sensors and devices, and autonomous operation. So it's not just about how we fly a drone, it's about all of these other technologies that go along with learning how a drone operates, learning how we program a drone, learning how we build a drone.
So it's not just about how we fly a drone. It's about all the other technologies that we wrap around that product. It's about all of the competencies and the learning opportunities for our students. What do we want them to be able to do, and what do we want them to know when we're done? That is what education is all about. I can tell you that one of our partners that believes strongly in the value of curriculum, strongly in the value of understanding learning outcomes, is a repeat guest, somebody we've already heard from on Webinar Wednesday, a gentleman by the name of Jason Everett from Amatrol. He joined us on another episode to talk about SkillBoss Logistics and tell us all about this new technology from Amatrol.
So SkillBoss Logistics uses a system of conveyors, sensors, 2D barcode readers, and other technologies to sort packages, similar to how packages are sorted in a distribution center. Packages are loaded at one end. Labels are read with a 2D barcode scanner. The packages are routed to one of three bins. Basically, SkillBoss Logistics is a mini distribution center. I like to categorize it in two different areas. One, it aligns to a new certification for MSSC, and it's the Certified Technician for Supply Chain Automation. And then the other way I want to categorize it, it's a system that's a mini mechatronic system. It can be built into existing mechatronics automation programs.
So some real cutting edge innovation coming from Amatrol, coming from their partners like MSSC as they look at new certifications in the world of supply chain automation. We'll hear about that just a little bit later today, but tremendous innovation coming from Amatrol. They weren't the only ones, however, who were innovating in education. Our friends at Quanser were really, really innovative this year as well, pivoting their business in much the same way that we did to a world of virtual learning. We were joined by their team earlier this year to talk about their new Interactive Labs digital platform for teaching controls technology. Here's what we learned that day.
Along with a lot of our hardware and software assets, we've been putting together these, some IP and some technology to be able to bring some of these concepts, to present them in a more immersive way. So we leverage the Unreal gaming engine. We have a lot of our products actually fully modeled both virtually and dynamically in this environment. And so we've had this technology for a while, and a lot of it, we use for promotional material and proof of concept. But really the power behind it is that it's a very high fidelity model or representation of what our products actually do.
So one of the silver linings of the year 2020 is all of the innovation that took place across education as we looked for new ways to provide experiences for our students, to keep them learning in spite of the fact that so many of them could not be in the classroom. We'll talk a little bit later about virtual learning as well, but on the front of new technology, there was tremendous innovation in the world of technical education this year, not just here in the United States, but around the globe. And part of our job is to bring great ideas from all over the globe to those of you that are here in the United States, delivering learning in the world of technical education. And so that is a big part of what we do, is sharing best practices, things that we're learning as we travel the country, as we travel the globe, as we learn about new approaches to technical education, to make sure that our educators here in the Midwest are absolutely up to speed on all these innovations. Let's talk a bit about some of those best practices. And speaking of traveling the globe, early on in this world of in this world of Webinar Wednesday, we talked about Industry 4.0 technology, and more specifically, we talked about alternative energy technology. And we had a gentleman by the name of Michael Dietrich, and Michael is the principal of a company called Lex Solar. Lex Solar is headquartered in Germany, and he jumped on and talked to us all about advancements in alternative energy learning. We also talked this year more about Industry 4.0 and how to teach Industry 4.0 in 2020. The year of 2020, we were not delivering learning the way that we always did. And we provided best practices coming from members of our team about how we continue to teach this fourth industrial revolution in spite of the fact that we were in times that none of us had ever experienced before. We talked about the 7 ways that portable learning systems were disrupting technical education. And so when we think about portable learning systems, systems that can move from classroom to classroom, from school to school, and yes, from student home to student home. And we talked about how portable learning systems were creating tremendous disruption in the world of tech ed. We also talked about the 7 elements of distance learning. Now, this was one of our more popular webinars. When we talked about, we talked to best people exhibiting best practices in education in terms of how they were continuing to deliver learning in the year 2020. When our students were at home, they were no longer at school, when they were learning virtually. And we put that into the 7 elements of distance learning. Again, one of the more popular webinars that we did all year. I want you to watch this quick video. We had our intern, Evan Cordabine, coaching our director of K-12 learning, Mike Dietrich, through a series of steps on the SkillBoss, on the Amarillo SkillBoss product. And so we were demonstrating how an individual who would learn remotely and coach their teacher who was in another building, in another facility, through a skill, demonstrating that the student had the competency that was being assessed. Here's how that went.
So now that I've got it at the right distance, I'm going to use my hands, take it back up to the top where I marked it with the pencil, and hand tighten.
When I'm working with inductive proximity sensors, what's one of the most important things I need to be aware of?
1 millimeter to closer or further away can be the difference between sensing the part or not. So if we test it and it doesn't work, I would open it back up, maybe move the sensor a millimeter closer, then test again until I've gotten the right distance.
Awesome, very good. All right, let's see how you did. Here we go, Evan. This is our first plastic piece. So it looks like it passed the quality check.
Our very own Mike Dietrich and Evan Cordabine demonstrating one-to-one learning via a virtual platform on a hands-on trainer, one of the 7 elements of distance learning. And I can tell you, based upon the number of people that emailed us with requests for links to that video, requests for the video itself, that we really struck a chord with that webinar on the 7 elements of distance learning. We also struck a chord with teaching 3D printing for industrial applications. Now, I will admit that I've always had this interesting relationship with the whole concept of 3D printing. And that goes back to my days of running industrial manufacturing operations, walking into somebody's educational institution, usually a high school, and the principal or the teacher saying, let's show you how we're teaching manufacturing. And they'd take me into a room and there were 7 3D printers with students downloading files and printing out these little figurines. That might have been manufacturing to them, but to somebody who had spent decades in the world of real manufacturing, that wasn't manufacturing. And so I developed a little bit of a resentment for how 3D printers were being used in education. But when we use them for true industrial skills, when we teach truly industrially relevant technologies, that's when they have tremendous value. Sean Pepper from the Baldwin-Woodville School District and Ron Olson from Madison College joined us on Webinar Wednesday to give us a couple examples. Here's what they had to say.
So I got one project here I wanted to show. It's a coin separator. So here I've got what it looks like. Handful of change. Just kind of set it on the top there and give it a shake back and forth. And then eventually you'll have coins separated onto each different tray.
Ron Olson, I want to pose the same question to you as your students are beginning their program. Talk a little bit about some introductory projects that they'll experience.
Just this morning, Matt, I finished off the Mark Forge machine here, our final version of that gear puller. So it turned out reasonably well. We got a few adjustments we're going to have to make, but this was a student design problem. They uploaded the models. I downloaded them, printed them here, and really went through a nice design process using 3D printing to prove out the design and get us ready for that next step.
So some great examples from Ron Olson and from Sean Pepper about how they are changing the experiences of their students in their classrooms and now remotely. Speaking of changing the experiences in classrooms, we talked about this summer, we talked about what education would look like in the fall of 2020. Think back to June or so of this year. None of us had any idea what was coming. In the midst of a global pandemic, districts not knowing how they would be educating their students, we talked to some of the greatest subject matter experts in technical education and said, what are you expecting come fall of this year? And in the spirit of sharing best practices with all of our viewers, we shared those back with you. We also shared best practices on Miller OpenBook, their online welding curriculum. Now, interesting, this is probably, in fact, I think it is, the video on our YouTube channel that has the most views. So certainly tremendous interest in how we teach welding virtually. And no, you can't teach an entire welding course virtually. You have to get students in the lab. You have to get them in the booth. But you can teach a lot of the theory. You can teach a lot of the concepts using virtual platforms. And that is what we shared with you in that particular edition of Webinar Wednesday. We also talked about the do's and don'ts of STEM e-learning. Some of the don'ts were things like, don't think that e-learning can completely replace a teacher. It can't. Don't think that all of your learners learn exactly the same way. They don't. But we went through the do's and don'ts of STEM e-learning. So as we were looking at virtual learning for our students, we could talk about what works well and what doesn't work so well. Again, all in the spirit of sharing best practices. We also talked about a pandemic-proof model for education. This was the episode where my friend Mike Bigley, who's the district administrator for the Whitehall School District in northwestern Wisconsin, joined us to talk about his program, where a student could be at home or at school, and not just at school in Mike's district, but in a neighboring district. So it didn't matter which school you were in, it didn't matter which district you were in, it didn't matter which district or school the teacher was in, it didn't matter if the teacher was in the school or at home. Any of those four options in the matrix, they were delivering learning in an incredibly flexible way. And they found a silver lining in that model as well when it came to the types of snow days and bad weather that can hamper education in northern Wisconsin.
As we get into the winter season coming, 2 years ago, we had 13 snow days up here. Snow days are no longer an issue. If it's unsafe for kids to go, we go full remote, and there we are. So we're
no more waking up in the morning dreaming of the snow day, huh?
And our teachers can still teach from here. They can come to school. It's usually safer. But so I think it's going to make everybody even more comfortable going forward.
So that was a great episode with Mike Bigley, who's a tremendous disruptor of technical education, not on purpose, but by virtue of the fact that he's always trying to do new things. And he shared those ideas with our audience on Webinar Wednesday. Another opportunity we had to share great ideas was when Jacob Gitter of the West Bend School District and Kelly Kwiatkowski of the School District in New Berlin jumped on Webinar Wednesday to tell us what they did to be so successful in winning CTE grants. Kelly talked to us about the importance of aligning the grant with the overall goals of the program. And here's what she told us.
So I think a best practice is just including yourself in any listservs, conversations in the region, talking to business partners. That helps you find grants. We always look at grants through a lens. Does it align with our strategic plan and where we're going? So if we know where we want to go in the end, we evaluate that grant through those lenses. For example, if we have a need to develop out our manufacturing pathway like we did, we're going to look for grants that specifically cater to that area or pathway.
And the other thing that Kelly and the School District in New Berlin do really, really well is partner with the local educators. And so on this topic of best practices in tech ed, they're great at winning CTE grants. They're also really, really good at building strong relationships with their industry and embedding credentials into their programs, both for funding and, more important, to create really, really cool career pathways for their students as they go through their program. So let's turn our sights now a little bit to that whole world of certifications and industrial training. We certainly had our share of that on Webinar Wednesday this year as well. We talked with Jim Wall of the executive director of the Smart Automation Certification Alliance on several occasions. He joined us once to talk about the value of micro-credentials, about how his program enables any educator in any technical education, any technical field, to align micro-credentials within the SACA certifications back to the competencies, back to the coursework in individual courses. And so Jim delivered a great message in terms of how we do that. We were also joined by Jim even earlier in the world of Webinar Wednesday, and just as the pandemic was beginning, to share more information about the Smart Automation Certification Alliance with our particular attendees that week on Webinar Wednesday. On the topic of credentials, probably, in fact, not probably, the most well-attended webinar that we have done on Webinar Wednesday was this one on the topic of supply chain automation. We had some great guests with us. We had Paul Perkins, who's the president of Amatrol. We had Steve Harrington, who is the executive director of the National Center for Supply Chain Automation. And the two of them joined us along with Neil Reddy from MSSC to talk about credentials in supply chain automation.
Now, the three certifications for supply chain automations include, first, equipment maintenance, maintaining equipment and systems, The second is equipment repair, so installing, modifying, troubleshooting, and repairing equipment systems. And network repair, so installing, modifying, troubleshooting, and repairing basic controllers and networks.
And those certifications are scaling incredibly quickly and giving technicians the certifications and the competencies they need to perform technical work on supply chain automation equipment. So that was just a phenomenal episode of Webinar Wednesday. Again, extremely well attended, tremendous traction afterwards in terms of people viewing that particular episode of Webinar Wednesday on our YouTube channel. So lots of sharing of best practices and credentials on that particular episode. We also talked about the value of credentials to manufacturing executives. Over the course of the summer, in fact, I had mentioned in our introduction that our entire team went through a series of earning credentials, some of them from the Smart Automation Certification Alliance. I earned their basic operations and advanced operations credentials this year. I wrote a magazine column and then did a Webinar Wednesday about how I wish I had gone through those courses 20 some years ago. All those years decades I spent running as CEO of manufacturing operations. These were things that I wish I had known before I became a CEO of a manufacturing operation, not 5 years after I, quote, retired from manufacturing and moved into the world of education. So we talked about how valuable those credentials and that learning was to me and would be to a manufacturing executive. We also did a topic for our industrial friends on the 7 secrets to partnering with educators, talking about best practices in creating partnerships with your local educators, how you're not the same, you don't think the same, you don't work the same, but you can do amazing things together if you understand each other and work toward common goals. We had an entire webinar on finding new talent where you least expect it. Mark Goodman from Amatrol joined us that week, and we talked about how do we port people over from retail, from hospitality, from entertainment, from other elements and other sectors of our economy into STEM careers, into manufacturing, into distribution, into logistics, and talked about the importance of doing that as our economy and technology continue to shift. And finally, on this topic of certifications and industrial training, Jennifer Llewellyn from Oakland County, Michigan Works joined us to talk about how we reskill displaced workers, people who have been displaced out of other elements of the economy and are looking for jobs in this world of manufacturing or of STEM or of industry or distribution and so on. Jennifer was a phenomenal guest on Webinar Wednesday. Finally, and this was a year of virtual learning. It was a year of virtual learning for all of us, learning about how we use virtual tools and how we deliver learning to our students using virtual platforms. And we were no stranger to those topics here on Webinar Wednesday. For example, we talked about why you need e-learning in 2020, why in the midst of a global pandemic where our students are not all in the classroom, why we need to be able to input e-learning platforms into their learning experience to keep them engaged and keep them interested in education. We talked in general about e-learning for technical education and how we could use various platforms of e-learning in tech ed and to teach technical aptitudes and technical competencies to our students. We had an entire episode about Lyft and their Ignite curriculum, and they were using that Ignite curriculum virtually at the time to deliver learning to high school students in the city of Detroit. On the topic of e-learning, we talked about the e-learning model that is proven to work. The e-learning model that is proven to work in the COVID era, self-directed learning. Let's take a look at that one.
How is the typical student in your program, the profile of that student changed in the period of time that you've been instructing?
Typical student, we really don't have a typical student. They're all over the board, which again makes it very enjoyable for us because you're not locked into a whole classroom of just one age group or something like that. The other thing, we really see a lot of that within our lab. It won't happen so much this year, but with the age spread, we would have a student that is 50, 55. We'd have another student in there that's going to be a typical high school student. And you begin to see interactions between those students. And in most cases, it's a very positive interaction. They're learning from each other. And that's been a very nice thing with it.
So that observation is from Kevin Barnes. Kevin is an instructor at Kellogg Community College in Western Michigan. Just a great guest, a great person, talking about how the typical student has changed in his program. Kevin is an absolute master at using virtual education and flipped classroom to run his program. He's been doing it for well over a decade. And so when this whole issue of COVID and the global pandemic came along, Kevin was ready. He already had a model under which his students and learners could continue their learning in spite of the fact that how they were getting in and out of their lab was a little bit different than what they were used to. One of the more memorable episodes for me was extended reality for safety training. If you were on this episode, you recall our own Ivan Manuel did a phenomenal demonstration of a platform for teaching safety training using Free Range XR's safety training platform, where we could teach lockout, tagout, we could teach confined space entry, fire suppression, fall protection using extended reality. And Ivan did just a great job with putting that webinar together, with showing the combination of what the experience for the learner was, what they were seeing when they were in their extended reality environment. And one of the things that made that webinar particularly memorable, we recorded a good chunk of it ahead of time to make sure it flowed well. We told that to you when we jumped on Webinar Wednesday that some of that episode was recorded. But I did the Q&A section of that from my iPhone while parked at a truck stop in Tomah, Wisconsin, showing the value and the flexibility of virtual platforms. So we literally did the Q&A section of that particular webinar while I was on my iPhone, watching the webinar on the iPhone, participating, and then answering questions from the audience remotely. What a year 2020 has been. And finally, we talked about the top 10 virtual trainers that we can use for industrial skills. There were tremendous examples. It was almost hard for us to pick 10. One of my personal favorites, probably just because I have a fascination with relay control, all my years in manufacturing created that for me, was demonstrating the electric relay control virtual trainer. And here's how that went on Webinar Wednesday.
Now on to Amatrol's electric relay control virtual trainer. This is one of my absolute favorites. I am a hands-on kinesthetic learner. Not every student is like that, but that's how I was. Sit through a lecture about control circuits? No way. If I could do it, then it would stick. This virtual trainer drives home relay logic and control circuits like no other. Push buttons, selector switches, solenoids, motors, cylinders, ladder diagrams, symbols, control logic relays, directional control valves. We can do all of the same things that we could do on a physical electric relay control trainer using this virtual version from Amatrol.
So what a journey it has been for us here on Webinar Wednesday, talking about all of the topics that you see on your screen right now. Looking back on this year of weekly webinars, who would have guessed that we would cover so much territory on information for technical education, on new technology, on best practices, on certifications and industrial training, and on all of the other topics that we were able to cover for you, especially in this year of 2020 virtual learning. It's been an absolute incredible journey. We have learned so much. We have learned so much from all of our guests. We have learned so much from all of our attendees, all the great questions that you have had. And I'm here today to tell you that as we look back on an incredible journey here on Webinar Wednesday, we are not finished. We are just getting started. Today, we put together our list for early 2021. Just a tremendous amount of fantastic guests, amazing topics, continuing to fulfill our mission of securing the American dream for the next generation of STEM and industrial talent by sharing all of this information with you and learning from you along the way. I want to thank first our producer, Melissa Martin, who has done just a great job on the technical side and in terms of getting guests ready for webinars, in terms of making sure that we had the right content. None of this would have happened without Melissa. I want to thank all of our amazing guests. We have had phenomenal guests this year. We talked about a bunch of them today. They took time out of their schedules to share best practices with those of you that come every week to hear all the great things that are happening in technical education. Most of all, I want to thank the literally now thousands and thousands of people who have joined us on Webinar Wednesday over the course of the last 9 months. It's been an incredible journey that we are on together. And like I said, that journey is just getting started. So I want to take this opportunity as we close out our time today to let you know that first, I look forward to next week where we look back on 2020 in technical education and talk about the 10 things that we have learned together and that 2020 has taught us in tech ed this year. With that, and until next week, happy holidays and Merry Christmas.